behalf of the college and the Phronēsis minor, let me thank you all for being here. I want to start with a word of thanks to our generous sponsors who've helped to make this event and others this year possible with funding grants. The Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center for Ethics and Leadership, directed by Dr. Williams. It has its home in UH's Hobby School of Public Affairs. Also, the Institute for Humane Studies, which supports the study of the liberal tradition and is dedicated to the advancement of intellectual and political freedom, and especially to the Jack Miller Center, a private nonprofit organization committed to advancing the teaching of America's founding principles and history. We're very grateful for their support of the Lyceum Initiative. The Lyceum Initiative is dedicated to a renewal of civic education here at the Honors College and within the university itself. Next year, we celebrate the centennial of UH. From our origins as an institution of higher education in 1927, through our formal charter as the University of Houston in 1934, our founding mission was dedicating the university to making excellent public education available and accessible to working class citizens of Houston and of Texas. Our charter says democracy depends upon an organized public education program which must be a continuous, lifelong educational process. Such an educational program is needed to provide a background for intelligent citizenship. Our original charter thus laid out the foundational responsibilities of the university to serve the public welfare by cultivating informed and engaged citizenship through education. Now, the Lyceum Initiative revives this fundamental commitment to the university's academic mission. Our purpose is civic and patriotic, but not partisan. Through this initiative, the Honors College joins a national movement in higher education dedicated to teaching civic literacy and civic virtue as essential facets of a liberal education and of American citizenship. Knowledge of and reflection on the fundamental principles of our constitutional order establish the true and enduring foundation for reasonable civic discourse, civic engagement and leadership, and Republican self-government. Now, Abraham Lincoln, in his Lyceum Address of 1838, foresaw the need for such civic education for each generation of American citizens. Lincoln gravely warned his fellow citizens of the dire threat posed to the nation by the political violence which accompanied the gradual erosion of respect for the rule of law and reverence for the principles of our constitutional order. The perpetuation of our political institutions, he argued, depended on civic learning, enlightened citizenship, and reflective patriotism in order for each generation to renew its devotion to constitutional self-government. The Lyceum Initiative takes up this task of cultivating the knowledge of the fundamental principles of our republic and the virtues and duties of good citizenship in order to preserve and perpetuate our constitutional order. We do so in part through this lecture series dedicated to celebrating the Declaration of Independence at its Semiquincentennial. Say it with me, Semiquincentennial. Yes, see, they know how to say it. That is the 250th anniversary of America's founding. Late in his life, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, writing in response to an invitation to speak at the first semi-centennial of the Declaration's signing, declined due to age, but sent his best wishes and a prayer that his fellow Americans would remember and cherish what he called the eternal principles of the Declaration. The eternal principles of the Declaration. In honor of Jefferson's prayer and Lincoln's summons, we have made the study of the Declaration's principles our explicit theme for the Lyceum Initiative lecture series this year. And one of those principles, of course, is prudence, subject of our lecture today. Prudence is a fundamental principle that must be taken as a guide not only by our leaders, but also by us, by American citizens. So let me now introduce Dr. Lucas Morel, who will deliver the fifth and final lecture in this series. Dr. Morel is professor of politics and the chair of the department at Washington and Lee University, where he has taught for more than 2 decades. He is a board member for the Jack Miller Center and a founding faculty member for the Jack Miller Center's Civics Initiative. In addition to his teaching at Washington and Lee, he also teaches courses in the master's program in American History and Government at Ashland University, and he teaches for the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. He also participates in high school teacher workshops sponsored by the Ashbrook Center, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the Jack Miller Center, and the Bill of Rights Institute. He received his bachelor's in government from Claremont McKenna College and his PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate University. He is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a consultant for the Library of Congress on its exhibits, and a former member of the Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. And he currently serves on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which has planned activities to commemorate and promote the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. His publications include several books on Lincoln, Lincoln and the American Founding, Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, and also 2 scholarly volumes on Ralph Ellison, The Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man, and The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. His most recent work is an edited volume that gathers together all of the writings of Frederick Douglass about Abraham Lincoln, which thus encourages us to read and reflect upon the prudent statesmanship of America's greatest leader, seen through the eyes and thought of one of the greatest citizen statesmen of the American Republic. That great citizen statesman was Frederick Douglass, and in his Prudence, he looked back on and wrote about the prudent statesmanship of President Lincoln. This work has as its core the theme of prudence, the exercise of practical wisdom in politics, which is also the subject of Dr. Morel's remarks for us today on the Declaration of Independence and its call for prudent reflection. Please welcome Dr. Lucas Morel.
Thank you, Dustin. I appreciate the invitation to speak, something I'm not going to use, about the subject of Phronēsis, which is a Greek word for prudence. But I want to say a couple of things at the jump. You mentioned civic education. Everybody's been talking about the great need that we have and have had for a while to try to be more conversant with the principles and structures of the regime. What I do with my students when I teach American government, I actually begin by talking about the difference between civic education and liberal education. You would think that those are synonymous terms. I don't know Latin, so I'm not going to pronounce civic the way the Latin specialists do. But civic, of course, means the city. It means politics. It means the nation or country, and in some cases, the state that you grow up in. Civic education typically means the answers that your people, fellow citizens and their forebears, the answers to questions that all societies take up. Like, how should we live? What are the things we honor? What are the things we don't like? Whereas liberal education is not so much about the answers, it's about the questions. It's about pushing back. It's about saying, all men are created equal? You sure? Who are these men of whom you speak? Does all really mean all? And so what I like about what the Lyceum Initiative is doing and the Honors College is doing here, from what little I've gathered, my short time here, is the fact that it's trying to show you how to engage both of those things. And it may be peculiar to the United States, I don't know, but it's at least the case that the United States wasn't simply born out of Washington's head. Right? That George Washington woke up one day and said, step aside, Jefferson, this is how we're going to do things, and just lays out what the Constitution should look like. That our history has been the product of disagreement, of debate, argument, and tragically, of course, violence at certain times. And the most momentous of those times was, of course, the Civil War. But I guess what I'm trying to do here is trying to show you that the way I think about what I do for a living, which is I teach politics, is yes, I do engage in civic education. And in particular, Abraham Lincoln. I do think somebody understood the founding so well and so profoundly that I'm persuaded by the answers Lincoln gave us as a country, most famously in his Gettysburg Address. I'm persuaded about the answers that are laid out in this thing that you have an expurgated version of. They left out the grievances. Those don't matter. It's the, it's the moral philosophy. We're trying to save paper. I am persuaded, as a citizen of this country, of the answers, the truths that we'll see they refer to as self-evident. I am persuaded that they're the right answers, not just because they came first, but because they are correct, and I don't think can be improved on. But the point of liberal education is to push back. The point of liberal education is to consider alternatives, and is to question those truths. And I would say that in American history, we've done that in a way that can be patriotic. There are, of course, ways that you could do it that are not patriotic and are subversive of the regime. But if you feel a little bit of tension, even being a student here at University of Houston, where you're being presented by claims to educate you about the city, right? You're being given or presented civic education. Part of making that education something your own is a wrestling with the claims to truth, a wrestling with the claims to how best to govern ourselves as a people. And I think that tension is a healthy one, the tension between being presented with answers and mastering those answers, what do these things mean, and calling them your own, and also not losing that curiosity that makes you think, well, is this right? Is this so? Can we do things better? And so I guess I don't want you to think that civic education is simply a case of we just got to get a bunch of K through 12 kids to memorize things, and that's how we're going to save democracy. Let's go ahead and spend more time memorizing things. I think the memorization follows once you identify these things as good things, as the right things. All right, so unprepared, you get that for free. Actually, you get the rest of this for free as well. So you have the declaration. I did not know that you were going to have this handed out to you. I'm actually going to make reference to it, but I have a much older, beat-up version that does have all the grievances in it. I'm not going to make reference to the grievances, but it's good that you have that with you because I'm going to be making a lot of references to the declaration. I'm also going to be making reference, I'm essentially dividing my talk in two parts. The first part is going to be a pretty close walk through the declaration, at least in terms of the elements of it that I believe reflect prudence, reflect Phronēsis. And I'll have to get to a definition of that in a second. I think the Declaration is the most important document in American history for a number of reasons, and I hope I get questions about that after. But given that we're talking about prudence, I also want to talk about, I think, the most prudential politician we ever had in this country, and that was Abraham Lincoln. And it's no surprise for me, I don't think it's a coincidence, that Lincoln can be seen as our most prudential politician. The word we use for that is statesman. I don't think it's a coincidence that Lincoln's prudence bears a strong correlation to the principles of the regime. I think he's not just the greatest student of America, I think he's the greatest defender and advocate of it. Defender not simply in terms of the fact that he was a commander-in-chief during the Civil War, but after all, he wrote the Gettysburg Address. And I think the greatest political speech in American history, which is the Second Inaugural Address. So he defended America, in short, not just through force, constitutional force as commander-in-chief. He became our greatest civic educator by defending America through words. So that by way of somewhat lengthy and unprepared introduction. I don't know about you, but when you think of the Declaration of Independence, do you think of prudence right away? I've got one nod. You're nodding because you think that's the right answer, or you actually do think of prudence when you think of the Declaration? Wow, is that the first thing? We're going to just have a conversation now. You do think of prudence? Is that one of the first things you think of when you think of the Declaration? Can you give me a pat answer, and then we'll probably have to switch places? No. No? Why prudence in the Declaration? And so you tie those to prudence? Dang it, that's what my talk's going to be about. Okay, she is not a plant. Very good. She's introduced us to some key terms here. I'm going to be honest, when I think of the Declaration, I don't immediately think of prudence. When I was asked to give this lecture, I'm like, oh, prudence, yes. It is mentioned. The good news is prudence is mentioned at least once in the Declaration. I think it's in more than one place, but the word prudence actually appears in the Declaration, so we're on safe ground there. But when I think of the Declaration, I think of the purpose of the Declaration, which was to be a statement of principles with regards to justifying our revolution. And so I guess in a roundabout way, when I ask about, the affinity between the Declaration and prudence, I think, well, you don't usually think of prudence when you think of revolutions. Revolutions don't strike me as the sorts of things that are kind of like the conventional way of thinking about prudence, something that's cautious and deliberate and slow. And in fact, the word prudence isn't really used very much by people today. I think the word pragmatic or pragmatist is a much more frequently used term. And so I'm going to, at some point, make a distinction between those two. But for me, at least, when I was thinking about my remarks about prudence, I thought, wow, yeah, it's mentioned once in the Declaration, but I don't usually think of prudence when I think of the Declaration. I think of things that are more, radical. In the Latin form of radical, it means root, right? Getting down to the bottom or the foundation of things. I think of that when I think of the principles of the Declaration, right? Equality, individual rights, government by consent, right of revolution, right? To alter or abolish, right? Those are terms or concepts, at least for me, that I don't immediately associate with prudence. But we're going to find if we take a more technical definition of prudence, and what distinguishes prudence from pragmatism, in my mind, is precisely because of the moral component that Aristotle believed Phronēsis, or prudence, had to have. It wasn't simply splitting the difference or log rolling in the way that a pragmatist would. So I guess the burden of my talk is going to establish for you not simply that the Declaration uses the word prudent or prudence, but that the Declaration is itself an expression of prudence. It's an expression of a particular character of the American people that was the product of finding a practical way to make good on the claims of right that they articulate in the Declaration of Independence. So it's a question of both, if you will, principles on the one hand. It has a moral component or an end to it, as well as the process. It's not just the what and the why. It's the how. And it's bringing those together, I think. That would be the case I would make, and I'm going to try to make, for the Declaration as an expression of prudence. And then we will see, in a way, America's greatest product, which is Abraham Lincoln, what prudence looked like at a key moment in the Civil War that we find in Lincoln's own politics. So, definitions of prudence. You guys, show of hands. Don't you hate when people ask you for a show of hands? Show your hands if you hate it when you're asked for show of hands. Good one. A few people got that. Those of you so it's a minor. Phronēsis is a minor. Does like the secret handshake come with a definition of Aristotle's understanding of prudence? You're a senior. Do you remember? No, I thought you were. I need a senior. I need to pick on somebody. Now no one's going to put their hand up. So definitions of Phronēsis, do you guys, is this part of the thing to either get in or get out of the minor? No?
Not yet, but we're currently creating a course which will entirely be called Prudence.
Oh, wow, okay. Good thing this is taped. What not to do, right? Aristotle, when you think, you'll see, usually prudence is defined crudely as practical wisdom. Practical wisdom, not just somebody who has a theory, not just someone who's got categories and ideals and concepts, but someone who can make these mean something in a particular situation, in a particular way, right? I'm applying what I know or claim to know in a particular circumstance. And the person that does that over and over and over again, as Aristotle says, right? The person that makes a habit of acting and choosing and deliberating this way, that's the person we call prudent. Right? He's got it after a while. It's one of the 5 intellectual virtues that are laid out in the Nicomachean Ethics. And so for him, it's wisdom about the means to particular ends. And it's something that comes not simply by reading a book. And in fact, the most important elements of prudence don't come from reading a book, according to Aristotle. You want to know how to become a prudent person? Find someone who has the reputation for prudence. That's Aristotle's solution. Find someone who has the reputation for prudence and watch them work. Watch them make decisions. I think this is one of the reasons that biographies are so popular in the United States, especially political biographies, because you see someone making decisions, not easy ones, but hard ones, time after time after time. Right? That's the person that we think, boy, he's not just smart, not just wise, he knew what to do, when to do it, especially at critical moments. And so, as I say, I want to show you how the Declaration weds or connects these principles, what they will call self-evident truths, with the how. How are we going to instantiate this thing? How are we going to make these things real for us? So let's begin at the beginning. The Declaration actually mentions prudence. You've got your little handy-dandy thing here. And it makes a claim in this 3rd paragraph. And in the original, of course, this isn't a separate paragraph. It's part of the paragraph that comes before, but this is helpful for us in terms of seeing things in groups. So to read this one, it says, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes." Light and transient causes. So what's practical about that, or if you will, to add the other part, what's wise about that? The practical and wise bit about that is that revolutions are serious business. To alter and abolish forms of government take a lot of work, and in a certain sense, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Who knows if the thing that you're replacing really is going to be better than, well, who knows if the thing that you're going to replace it with is better than the thing that you already have. So the first thing that the Declaration says is, look, we've got all these true things, these awesome things, and wouldn't it be great if political life was organized this way? But people aren't wired that way. People pretty much will put up with not just bad things, evil things. They have this kind of political inertia to them as long as they can suffer these things, suffer these evils. What's the line in The Godfather, the first movie? Blood is a big expense, right? You don't want to have to resort to blood unless, we'll see there's this key word that's used 3 times in the Declaration, unless the time is right. But secondly, there are times when push comes to literal shove. Jefferson, the chief draftsman, of course, as you know, of the Declaration of Independence, there's a phrase here that he lifts word for word from John Locke's second treatise of civil government. So let me finish that prudent sentence and then we'll get to the Locke phrase. So we don't change them for light and transient causes. All experience hath shown, and prudence is about experience. What do you learn over time? Experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. And then here's the lift from Locke. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, Jefferson wishes he came up with that phrase. It was so good, even he couldn't improve on it. So in a long train, not light and transient causes, but a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design, a pattern. To reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future securities. In other words, when you see the pattern developing, as it were, despotism is on its way. You don't wait for despotism to finally arrive. Hello, tyranny at your door. To wait would be too late to respond. And so, in a sense, we are making the argument it was time to take preemptive action. When we see, these aren't mistakes repeatedly being made, it seems like they're trying to put the clamps on us here. And you don't wait till you're tied up to then decide, oh, I see what you're trying to do. It's too late to fight back. Right? So it was time to take preemptive action. Notice the combination of terms right and duty. The Second Continental Congress, which edited Jefferson's original draft, what they came down to saying as an expression of the American people is, there came a point in time that we were so aware of our rights and liberties being infringed by someone who didn't have authority to tell us what to do, that in a way it would be beneath our dignity to continue to suffer these evils. In other words, there was a certain time where we were in possession or aware of our rights, but it wasn't time yet to do anything serious about it. But at a certain point, our awareness of our nature as a free people was such that we thought, you know what? Our right does need to become a duty. In a way, we don't have a choice. Right? If we take our freedom seriously, which is to say, if we understand freedom and liberty correctly, we have no choice but to stand up for ourselves. And if they've refused to recognize that we don't deserve to be told what to do by them, if they refuse, then we will hold them, as he says later, as enemies in times of war and in peace. Friends. There's this phrase where he mentions King George III. Some people thought he was a turd. That was not a deliberate Freudian slip. If you look on the second, or any of them ever deliberate, the second page at the very top, it's the last line, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of what? A free people. He may be fit to be the ruler of a servile people, but not a free people. It invites the question, who is fit to rule or govern a free people? The answer to the Declaration, of course, is those people themselves. As my great teacher, Harry V. Jaffa, once said, no man is born the natural ruler of anyone but himself. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that July 4th, wait for it, came after July 2nd. Some people are writing this down. Make sure you write that down. This guy was awesome. He told us July 4th came after July 2nd. Why do I mention July 2nd? July 2nd is when we formally announced to the world that we were no longer going to be governed by Great Britain. 3 things were mentioned in that resolution. I'll just sum them up. Colonies deserve to be independent of Great Britain, i.e. no longer told what to do. Second, they should seek foreign allies. Right? There's the practical part of our wisdom. In other words, we may deserve to be an individual separate nation, a sovereign nation, but we probably won't be very successful in that attempt unless we get friends. So we need foreign allies. And these United States, that united part that we take for granted now, it was clear at the time. Who was it that said that we either hang together or we'll hang separately? Sounds like a Franklin thing. Too good to check. But the idea of forming a confederation, a stronger union, we recognize none of the states thought they could just go it alone. Even though they had the right to be sovereign states, Practically speaking, in other words, their prudence was displayed precisely in the fact that they needed to make this thing a united effort. And it wasn't just get us through the war. If the unity helps us through the war, it's not optional after. Odds are we have to stay unified in order to stay free. And of course, we'll see that will be the major complication in getting rid of slavery right away. So we've got to be independent. We deserve to be independent. We need allies, and we need to stick together. So this, as I understand it, is the prudential how of American independence. One thing to remind ourselves here, of course, is that July 4th, 1776 also comes after 1775. Just brilliant stuff. I've come all the way to Houston to tell you. We've been at war for a year. This is a document that looks like the product of peaceful, calm deliberation in a building. And the fact of the matter is we've been at war for over a year. We're doing this in the midst of a challenge to our exertion of our independence. We had come to the point by July 1776 that we were going to be free or die trying. Notice this, right? The betting odds in Vegas at the time was that we were not going to defeat the greatest naval power on the earth. France doesn't come in to help us till later, and it's crucial to our eventual victory. But the point is, we had come to a time, to a moment where we thought it's even worth losing in order to stake our claim to ruling ourselves. Now, let me march us through some other points quickly so that we can actually get to Lincoln. What are some other marks of prudence? The march, as I see it, of deliberation and peaceful political overtures to Great Britain to redress our grievances. The obvious moral components are the ones you guys are most familiar with. If you turn back to the first page and you see an appeal made, why do we deserve to be our own people, our own, to govern ourselves as a people? We make an appeal to a standard that's not a human standard, what the philosophers would call positive law. We don't make a reference to any sort of man-made constitution. We go beyond all earthly political institutions, and we refer to this classic Lockean expression of principle called the laws of nature and of nature's God. We are presenting an argument to a world of diverse languages, to be sure, diverse religions, diverse outlooks and experiences and history and traditions, but we are claiming that there are these fixed things, fixed meaning not changing, eternal things that are found or apprehended, not hypothesized or assumed, but apprehended through one's reason in nature and what they call nature's God. I don't know that we're used to that adjective in front of God. I mean, God is God. Right? But they're claiming that there is something in nature through your senses and reason that you can discern the divine attributes of the cause of all these things. The short version of this is that there is a natural theology that's intrinsic to the argument being made in the Declaration of Independence. 4 separate references to God, but none of them are explicitly sectarian, denominational references or appeals to a particular revealed truth of a religious text. There's a moral economy of the universe that can be discerned not by reference to a religious authority, but simply by the application of your reason. I've been saying or using this word reason a lot, or apprehend a lot. Notice the way the argument is formulated. It's formulated as if you don't have to share the same religion, the same experience, or the same history to see that the claims we are making are so. That is to say, that they are true. Laws of nature and of nature's God, right? These can be found everywhere. They transcend positive law. 2 references to opinions, right? We say in the list of grievances, we say, let facts be submitted to a candid world. In other words, we are so confident in the action that we are taking as being the right action, the just action. Regardless of whether we win or not, we deserve to win. Right is on our side. But we also say a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. Opinions plural. In other words, we assume people are going to have different opinions about the action we are taking, but we challenge them to follow the arguments that we are articulating. We challenge them to see if it is not so. We are so confident in the action that we are taking that we think they will see that we are correct. And moving quickly from moral ends, the moral component of our appeal, what's the other part of prudence? Is the practical. What about the means? We go on in the document to make reference to two different ways that we have tried to seek a redress of our grievances, right? Practical appeals to justice. The first one being to the political powers that be. Where is that? Where he says, he makes yes, the very top of the second page. In every stage of these oppressions, this is after the he has, all the charges and condemnations of King George III. In every stage, we have petitioned, that's a political term, as subjects, we're now going to start calling ourselves citizens, but as subjects, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. In other words, we weren't trying to separate. We were trying to remain free within the British Empire, and it turned out we learned we couldn't remain in the British Empire and exercise our freedom as we came to understand it. But at a certain point, we did try to stay within the empire. We petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. To what effect? Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. And then the next thing we did is we said, it's not just politics. We've got blood over there. We have relationships. We've got relatives. We've got friends. Next paragraph. Nor have we been wanting, which is to say, we haven't been lacking in attentions to our British brethren. We've warned them. We've reminded them. We've appealed. Look at this third sentence. Appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. Notice, native. In other words, this isn't a British thing. This is a human thing. We have presented our grievances, and we thought, one human to another, you would see the injustice of what your government is doing to us. Result, they too have been deaf to the voice, here it is, second time, justice and consanguinity. Conclusion, we must acquiesce in the necessity which denounces, which is simply a way of saying proclaims, which denounces or declares our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So we have made political overtures, and we've made, if you will, informal or personal overtures. We said, look, help us out here. Can't you see that what's being done here, it's not that it's not simply un-British, right? It's wrong. It's simply wrong. And even that has fallen on deaf ears. I could talk about self-evident truths. I'm not going to spend too much time on this for the sake of time, but if you look in the second paragraph, it begins with this statement about truths that are self-evident, which is to say, these aren't mere opinions of ours. We actually think. Now, we're the only ones who hold them. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But these are, if you will, the first principles or the first truths. These are truths that carry their own evidence along with them. In other words, you can't take them to a lab. You don't titrate this thing. You don't get on a chalkboard and lay out a proposition and prove it like you do like Euclid's geometry. These are simply the truths from which other truths are arrived at, concluded. And the beginning with the truth, what Lincoln called the central idea of America, the truth that all men are created equal. If you know what the word all and men, meaning men and women, and if there's debate about that, I can pretty quickly establish to you within the Declaration itself that when they used the word men, they meant men and women. If you know what all men created and equal means, if you know those terms, that's as much evidence as you need to know of the truth of that statement. And then all the other truths that they claim are self-evident are cohere or consistent with that. So what I'm trying to show you is that the Declaration here in so many ways weds together both these moral principles and these moral appeals with practical expressions of practical attempts of trying to press these truths into practice, and in hopes that we could finally achieve this goal, which is self-government, to assume among the powers of the earth that separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. I want to look at one more word before I pivot for just a few minutes to Lincoln. This word necessity comes up 3 times in the Declaration. And it wasn't until I was preparing for this event and this talk that that stood out to me. Let's look at those. The first one is in the first paragraph. When in the course of human events, as I've been saying earlier, when it was time, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, right, and then to become their own country. At a certain point, we thought there was a certain kind of compulsion to take this action. That's one mention of necessity. Where are the other 2? I'm using if you turn this to the second page, that middle paragraph. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and peace. Friends, to acquiesce, to go along with, to succumb to the necessity. It was necessary to do this. And then where's the third one? I'm trying to use your version here, since you've got that in front. I bet you it's on the first page. No? Oh, does anybody get there before I do? First page? Nice. Thank you. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. So when we think of necessity, usually we think of something done or something you have to do that's beyond your control, that you don't have a choice. But the odd thing about this case, like, I had to do it, you put a gun to my head. The odd thing in this case is the gun being put to our head doesn't produce the will or the desire of the person holding the gun. In this case, the gun put to our head, the oppressions we have repeatedly suffered, actually produced the opportunity for us to make a choice contrary to what they were trying to compel us to do. In other words, by necessity in the Declaration of Independence, and here is where I tie it to Prudence, the necessity of the Declaration of Independence is a moral compulsion. The necessity is a moral compulsion. It's not a compulsion under duress. We're not forced to do this. We're not acquiescing in it because somebody has power over us. It's precisely because we see the injustice of their power over us that after peaceful, political, relational attempts have been made to redress our grievances, we make a choice based on our moral understanding of who we are as a free people, and say, a free people can put up with a lot, but we won't put up with everything. And that's where things stand on July 2nd and July 4th, that we have a moral compulsion to take this action to ensure our freedom. And that freedom requires a new foundation for our liberty. We have to become a separate people. Now, I want to leave time for questions, but I want to mention at least one thing with regards to Lincoln, who I said, for me, is the exemplar of a politically prudent, which is to say, a statesman-like politician. I think he is the great example of that in American history. I'm just going to mention one of the things he was most famous for. When you think of Lincoln, you usually think of two things. You think of savior of the Union, preserver of the Union of the American states, and the liberator of slaves, right? The great emancipator, right? That's his reputation. Now, the interesting thing about emancipation for Lincoln is on March 4th, 1861, he took office claiming it was a time of peace, even though citizens of 7 states didn't think they were part of the United States anymore. They had seceded in their minds. But on March 4th, 1861, no shots fired, no war yet. Lincoln says, I have neither the power nor the inclination to touch slavery where it exists. He's a Republican. He's the first Republican president, and their platform had said that they disagreed with the ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, that said that Congress didn't have power to regulate slavery in the territories. They obeyed the decision, but they would try, if they got into power, to get the court to reverse that decision. Turns out, in the middle of the war, April and in June, in two months in 1862, Congress banned slavery in the District of Columbia, and then in June, banned slavery from all the federal territories, even though Dred Scott is still technically good law. Different party, different results. What do we say? Elections matter? Yeah, elections matter. But how did Lincoln get from March 4th, 1861, I have neither the power as president nor inclination, personally, to touch slavery where it exists, to January 1, 1863, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. If I had time, I would march you through all the different steps that show one decision after another decision after another decision where Lincoln is exercising, he's demonstrating prudence in real time. He's responding to other people's attempts to emancipate, like General Fremont in August of 1861. David Hunter down in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, trying to emancipate there, where he declares martial law in May of 62. In both instances, Lincoln says, that's not your decision. That's not your authority. And in Hunter's case, well, in both cases, he had no idea they were going to try to do this. He makes it clear, you don't get to do that. If anybody has that authority, I do, and you've got to revoke those actions. What happens in July of 1862? Lincoln shares a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinet. Best kept secret in Washington. He shares a draft with them, and he's persuaded by his Secretary of State, Seward. Great idea, not yet. In other words, the timing isn't right. It would look like a desperate move on your part, last gasp of the federal government. It would actually backfire on us. Let's wait for a key military victory to show that we could put teeth into this proclamation. Lincoln's persuaded. Horace Greeley, the most famous newspaper editor of the day, editor of the New York Tribune, publishes an editorial titled The Prayer of 20 Millions. You can do that when you own the paper. Prayer of 20 Millions, where he condemns Lincoln for not enforcing the confiscation acts of Congress. This comes out on August 19th. August 22nd, Lincoln responds with a letter to Greeley where he says, I want to make it clear what my policies are. Without question, what is the goal of this war? On my end, to save the Union. And he repeats that almost ad nauseum in this short public letter. And he says, what I do about slavery, whether I free none to save the Union, free them all, even in the loyal states, to save the Union, or free some and leave others alone, right? I will judge when to do it, and it's all as a result of my determining emancipation not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. As I like to put it to my students, Lincoln eventually, after the Battle of Antietam in September, he chooses that repulse of Robert E. Lee as the key Union victory to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He decides at that time, as I put it to my students, to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. You see that? He did not think that the Constitution vested a president with the authority or the power simply to do the right thing, simply to do moral things. It had to be connected to some end or power vested in the President of the United States. And so to do the right thing for Lincoln, he said the American way is you have to do it in the right way, a constitutional way. And that's eventually what he does on January 1st. So to close, I want to cite someone that was mentioned in the introduction, and it's a man named Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was one of Lincoln's fiercest critics during the war. As was mentioned earlier, the last book that I published was an anthology of all the writings of Frederick Douglass about Lincoln. And I joke with my co-editor that we could have titled it Mad at Lincoln, because most of the stuff that Frederick Douglass says about Lincoln, it's like, you didn't do it quick enough, thoroughly enough. In other words, you didn't do it the way I would do it. Because Frederick Douglass is an abolitionist, and Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He's anti-slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. Well, after Lincoln is assassinated, Douglass is invited, and this is 11 years later, he's invited to give the eulogy for Lincoln at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial. I don't know if you know this statue in D.C., which has Lincoln, like Emancipation Proclamation in one hand and kind of a benedictory gesture in the other, and there is a crouched slave at the moment of liberation. It's a snapshot. It's not a film. Douglass didn't like the statue. We can get to that in question and answer if you want. But Douglass says in this speech that Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, shared the prejudices of white men. And Douglass says, as an abolitionist, I thought he should have turned this war into an abolition war from the jump. But then I'll close with this. This is the climax, in my opinion, of this speech that he delivers April 14th, 1876. Describing Lincoln, his great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin. Second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To free his country from the great crime of slavery, he said to do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, Douglass's approach, Douglass says he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. That's Douglass's way of saying, I was wrong. If he had followed my advice, neither salvation of the Union nor emancipation of slaves would have happened. And then the concluding sentence. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. It's rare that a great man admits he's wrong. And in this case, I argue Frederick Douglass admitted that Lincoln was right and he was wrong. He admits and argues here that Lincoln moved as fast as the consent of the governed would allow on the thing that Douglass wanted Lincoln to do from the jump. I'll pause there. Time to evade your questions.